How's it going today, guys? In part, I don't even know what number I'm on now, of the series that just won't die on chainsaw milling, I want to show you guys how I go about milling. I found a cherry log in my pile, so I've already shown you an ash log being milled, I did a pine, and today we're going to do cherry. And this is a much softer wood, so I think I'm going to have better results milling. And the diameter of this log is 11 inches. But what I'm going to do today, guys, I'm going to break this video into 3 parts. The first part is going to be me showing you this little toolbox I've got with all my chainsaw milling tools. So if you want to see that, just keep watching right here. If you want to skip ahead, I'm gonna take a standard chain and sharpen that to a 10-degree angle. Over the weekend, I went to Tractor Supply and I got a file holder which has the 10-degree angle on it. So I'm just going to go to the garage and show you how I go about sharpening a chain. So if you want to see that, I'll put a link over here and you can skip right ahead to that. And then the final thing we're going to do in the video is go ahead and start milling the log. And if you want to just go right to the milling the log and see how it looks to be milled, I'll put a link down here. So while I was at Tractor Supply yesterday, I think I mentioned I got a file guide. And this file guide, if you take a look at it, it's got a 10-degree marking. The innermost markings are 10 degrees. And that is usually the recommended angle for sharpening milling chains. I put a tape measure because that's vital to have when you're milling. And also, you know, this holder I have, I was at Tractor Supply and I was in the feed area, and it's not really designed as it's a toolbox for something, I'm not really sure what, but I just love these little totes, they're very handy. I've got my 2 clamps for holding my boards onto the end of the log. Got my small file here, so I can level my my guide boards on the end of the log. I also picked up a lifting hook at Tractor Supply yesterday too, and I'm curious to see, you know, how this guy goes. I've given it a try already, and the log didn't spin very easily, but I'm also thinking that maybe because I didn't have my my log dogs in, it didn't spin much. And the interesting part about this lifting, this is by John Sared lifting hook, but I don't know if you can see there or not, but this is yet another thing that's made in Sweden. So my timber jig is made in Sweden, the pine that I used to build the rail for the timber jig is made in Sweden, and now my lifting hook is made in Sweden too. So I guess Sweden is more of a world power in lumber than we realize. Okay, so then I've also got my log dogs, and this is what caught me, this nice little pocket right here to hold a log dog. So I had them hanging in my shop and they were just kind of being in the way, so now I can just put them right in there. And then I've got a little Sharpie here so I can mark the logs. I've brought a whole bunch of 2.5-inch screws. The directions for Logasol say to use a minimum of 3 1/8 screws. Maybe that's with pine. With the hardwoods we're doing, my drill doesn't have the torque to put them in to 3 1/8. And then I've got a 3-pound sledgehammer for manipulating my my log dogs if I want to bang them to get them into the wood. And I can also just use my cant hook to do that as well, but sometimes it's just easier with the hand sledgehammer. And then I got my Makita drill with a full charge. So hopefully we're good to go. However, I can be the most organized and keep it simple and not have to search for things. And I kind of take it to the level where if I can be organized and actually like see into the box and see things, the better. Just like when I go in the cupboard and I'm looking for something, if it's not like right in front of me, if the mustard is behind the mayonnaise, I'm just never going to find it. So so this is my little milling box, which is going to have all the necessities I need for milling, so I can just leave this on the shelf. And some of these tools I'll have to put back, like the clamps and the drill, but a lot of this other stuff I can just leave in the box, and then when I'm going to go mill some logs, I know I've got everything I need. And you know, you don't get out there in the middle of the woods somewhere at somebody's house and end up missing something you need. So what we're going to do now is take our file holder and just sharpen all the cutters on this chain. This is an Oregon 72 LGX chain. I'm going to sharpen all the cutters down to 10 degrees and see if that makes the wood a little bit smoother when I'm milling the wood. And I just want to talk a little bit about the chains. I have been using a 72J GX chain, which is a skip tooth chain. So you've got a cutter and then 2 drive links, then another cutter. And I sharpen that to 15 degrees. And I really like the way that cuts. But most milling chains are actually a 10-degree angle. So I'm curious to see if that 10-degree angle cuts a little more efficiently, and also if it leaves a smoother wood. And the last time I sharpened the chain, when I was milling the ash, when I sharpened my chain the first time, I did lower the depth gauges. Today, I'm not going to lower the depth gauges after I change the angle to 10 degrees and see if it's a little bit less aggressive. I think that might be why the wood has been so rough. I think I may have taken my depth gauges too low on this chain. Skip tooth chains can be a much more aggressive cut. They can kick back more. So again, if you're new to chainsaws, don't mess with them. But if you've been using saws for a while, you might want to try ordering one and just be very careful, for lack of a better term. Make sure you got your safety gear on. When I was at Tractor Supply over the weekend, there was a Poland chainsaw which had a skip tooth chain, and it was a smaller saw, but then it had safety bumpers between the skip teeth. So I guess that was one way that they took advantage of the lower power saw, or made the lower power saw be able to do more. If you hand file and you're good at it, you can pretty much make your chains sharper than they were when they came out of the box. I've gotten to the point now where if I'm using a chain and I think it's dull, or it gets hit by a rock, and I switch to an out-of-the-box chain, the second I start cutting, I start kind of wondering, why the chain is dull. And it's just that I'm used to having my saws sharper than out of the box. So it's really a good skill to learn to hand file, because it's more convenient to file in the woods. But it's also, you can really get a sharper chain, again, assuming you're keeping the chain sharp and being safe. So right here, this is a tooth that I filed at 15 degrees. And that's the profile you see on that tooth there. So there's the profile you see on the Oregon straight out of the box chain, and you see that one in the middle there? You see the hook on that chain? I mean, they have a pretty aggressive hook when they come out of the box, and sometimes I always wonder if I'm doing okay when I sharpen, because I think I don't have enough hook or too much. But I just want to kind of put this on file. This is what an Oregon chain looks like fresh out of the box, so we can all remember what it's supposed to look like when it's got a pretty good angle. So this is the tooth we're trying to sharpen, and again, this is right out of the box chain. So there's a line on the file guide. We're just lining up with the tooth, and we can see it's at 25 degrees. You see how there's one line there? This line is parallel to the bar, so that means I'm at 25 degrees. So what we're trying to do, what I did with the last one, is I just lined it up with the file guide where there's the 15-degree line. So I would put it like that, make sure it's parallel to the bar, and you see that line there? So this line right here, as long as that's parallel to the bar, we can make that angle a little more blunt. So today what we're going to do is we're just going to use the 10-degree angle on my new file holder. Make sure that's parallel to the bar, and that line is parallel to the bar, so we want to do it just about like that. And it doesn't have to be perfect. The saw is still going to cut well, but the closer to perfect you are, the better she's going to cut. So this is 25 degrees, so all I need to do, I'm going to just hold the file with one hand so you can see it, is it's going to take me maybe 10, 15 strokes. You want to hold this at a 90-degree angle, perpendicular to the chain. And if you can see the edge of the tooth, you can't see it very well. It's a much more blunt angle. So that tooth has now been sharpened to 10 degrees. Now something I do whenever I sharpen with a hand file is first I'll go around and do all the cutters, but I'm not gonna show that. After I do all the cutters, I'll go back with the file, and I would normally be using two hands, but I'll clean out that gullet. And it's funny, this is an older file, but it's a much better quality file than the one I've been using. So usually I'll do like half the number of strokes I used on the teeth, give or take. But I like to clean that gullet out. And this might be a bit excessive, but this way when you're sawing, the chip has somewhere to go. But also, the next time I file, instead of using all my effort to remove the metal that's below the cutting edge of the tooth, I'm only going to have to do a little bit of filing to remove basically the tip of the tooth. You can focus the energy of the file on the tip of the tooth as opposed to just cleaning out. So then, here I can see that my edge isn't, super smooth, so I can always go back and just give it a little tweak. So that is sharpened to 10 degrees. And I can feel the edge. So we'll see how that one does. But it doesn't really take that long to sharpen the chain from whatever the standard angle is to another angle. And just remember, if you're hand filing, I think it's a big help to me where you can go back and clean out that gullet after you do some hand filing. And the thing I like about my Oregon file guide is the way the file gets held on is just with these clips. So what I'll do is I'll just sharpen the whole chain, and then I can just pop the file right out of there and clean out my gullets. And it's much easier to pop the file guide out and do it that way than a file guide like this, where you have to undo the screw. Not a huge deal, but originally I thought this was kind of cheesy with these hooks, but now I kind of like it because it's so easy to pop it out. And then what I can do as I'm filing along to make sure I don't go a little too crazy with one tooth or the other is just take this adjustable wrench and put it on the tooth, and then I can just check. See, this isn't even going to fit. It's not even going to fit over these other teeth because I took the angle out of it. And again, this doesn't have to be, dead perfect. But I can always do this when I'm checking my teeth to make sure I took the same amount of metal off of all of them. And if you're hand filing, every 5 or 6 times you file, take your adjustable wrench out and check the length. And if one side is longer, give a few extra strokes on that side. If there's 1 or 2 teeth that are really long, get them back as close to the right length as you can. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. But what you do is the closer you have your teeth to all being the same size, the more evenly your chain can work. So rather than, whichever cutters are highest cutting the wood, you're going to have every tooth doing, sharing the load. Because if one tooth is really long, that means it's higher and it's going to take a bigger bite. And these other teeth might not even do any of the work. One other thing I just wanted to mention, and this happens to me once in a while, is if you're trying to line up your angles and they're just not working, I always like to make sure the angle I'm sharpening with is on the outside of the chain. Well, I've got my angles backwards, so the angle I want is actually on the inside, so by the time I line it up, it would be a very short stroke. So if this ever happens to you, all you need to do is you just flip your file holder around, and by flipping it around, you've now got the 10-degree angle on the outside, so when you're lining things up, you've got a lot more to work with. So I marked my tooth, and the orange one is always the one I start with, that way I don't get confused. And I used to use black to mark them, but sometimes if the chain was dirty, I didn't notice it, and I ended up going around twice. Now I'm not going to mess with the depth gauges, but the next thing we would do is to just put our drop center depth gauge tool on, and this is 25 thousandths. And I actually am, the way I test depth gauges is I don't look, I just run it across the top. I am actually bumping. I am bumping the depth gauges, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave these depth gauges high right now, and if I start cutting and it's a little too slow, which I suspect it will be, I'll just stop the saw and I'll go out to my stump out there, and I can always lower them. I think last time I had these guys set too low, so it was taking a lot of power from the saw to make it work. So before I put my guides on, I just want to go over my plan of attack for this log. What I want to do is make some fencing out of it, some boards for fencing, and these boards they're about 3/4 of an inch thick. And it doesn't really matter the width of the board. I'm just going to try to shoot for 3/4 of an inch and get the maximum use out of this log. Now unfortunately there is some holes, there's some rot in this log, so it may not be any good, but I'm still just curious to see how it does with the cherry. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on my rails, and I'll see if I can get a good cant out of the top, a good cut, and then we're going to roll the log once it's cut like this, and then I'll screw my guide board over here somewhere and try to get a nice sharp 90-degree corner on this, maybe even a little bit lower. And then what we can do once we've got our two cuts in is we can use the timber jig and set the timber jig for whatever height we want on these two 90-degree corners to make our cant. So whatever height we set our timber jig at is the width of our cant. And that'll cut a third way down here. Then all we have to do is take our cant, which hopefully is going to have a nice square corner to work with over here, set our timber jig for 3/4 of an inch, and just slice off some boards across the bottom. That's my plan of attack for this log. If I didn't set my depth gauges deep enough, I'll stop the saw temporarily, lower the depth gauges a touch, and then just keep cutting. If you just joined the video because you're skipping ahead, I mentioned before that I left my rakers a little bit high when I sharpened my chain. So apparently I left them a little bit too high, so I'm just going to go and take probably 2 strokes off the rakers, round out the edges, and give it another try. During the day when I sharpen my depth gauges, I usually don't use the depth gauge tool, that drop center tool I had in the garage. And I'll usually just do one or two strokes across the top to lower the depth gauges. And once I do my 2 strokes across the top, I'll always do 2 strokes to round out the front of the depth gauge as well, because the smoother your curve is on the depth gauge, the smoother it's going to cut through the wood. It's going to go through the wood. Now at the end of the day, I will take the drop center depth gauge and make sure they're all set to the right height, so when I start the next day's cutting, I know I'm good to go. Even though you take the same stroke, you don't always end up taking the same amount of metal. So what we're going to do here is and this isn't exactly the way I'd set it up, but I'm trying to keep it sunny, is we'll just do 2 strokes on the top, and then 2 strokes, and I don't round my strokes on the top all the way over. I just want to make sure it's not like flat and then curves down. And then we'll just move to the next one. 2 strokes on top, 2 strokes to round over. Two strokes on top, 2 strokes to round over. Now you want to make sure you get a depth gauge file. It's a small flat file. It fits between the teeth really nicely. There have been times I've tried using a really big, long, regular file, and it's just too big to get in there. So this one is the right size where you can manipulate it just right to get to those depth gauges. If you do this and you're still not cutting in enough, you can always cut a little bit more. The problem with taking your depth gauges too far is your saw gets extremely aggressive. And when you're cutting, it'll actually pull into the wood. And when it pulls into the wood, it can pull the nose of the bar into another log. And then because your depth gauges are so low, they'll end up kicking that saw back really hard at you. And we don't want that. So we're just going to lower them a little at a time. So once I do all the teeth on this side, I'll just switch my body around to the other side, and I'll sharpen the depth gauges on the other side. I know some people do sharpen all their depth gauges from one side. I just find it's easier and better for me to alternate sides, the same as when I sharpen the teeth. This is a much more comfortable position for me to be filing my depth gauges. One thing I forgot to mention was, when you're doing this, you want to be very careful not to hit the cutting edge of the tooth. Now that's where I usually do use that drop center depth gauge to kind of block the tooth as I'm filing. But if you're careful, you can get away with it. Now this is also because this chain is 10 degrees. There's a lot more space between the edge of the depth gauge and the cutting edge of the tooth. And that's all of them. So now we can go back and give it a try. If it's not digging deep enough, I'll lower them a little bit more. If we're getting a good bite, I'll leave them the way they are. I'd rather take too little with the depth gauges than too much, because if you take too much, that saw is going to be really grabby and it's going to really want to kick back on you if something happens. Okay, so the rakers are a little bit better, but I'm going to knock them down another 2 strokes and see if that helps out. It's a much smoother cut. I'll take the camera off the tripod and show you. And the only other thing is I didn't wear my my helmet today, and I'll tell you, I kind of missed that screen because the bark of the tree keeps kicking up and hitting me in the face. So the next shot you'll see I'll have my full headgear on with the face mask as well. One thing that happened when I was milling that pine log, and it happened again today, is the tip of my bar seems to be settling on this side. And I think I did clip this board again today. But if you take a look, you can see how this side is clearly, I don't know, what's that, about 3/8 of an inch high. And this side is maybe 1/8 to 1/16 down at this edge. Not really sure what I could do about that. But that seems to be one of the things I'm noticing. But if you take a look at the log, it's clearly much smoother than the last ones I did. I mean, it's still, you can feel some ridges in it, but from a distance of about 5 feet or more, it's definitely a much smoother log. And it's kind of weird because the side I started on is actually a little bit bumpier. So we're making progress. The cut is definitely a lot smoother with the regular chain, the normal chain. And I mentioned that I was cutting the holder for the rail, and I think what I'm doing is I've got the log rotated so much that my chainsaw is kind of coming off the log. About halfway through the log, I noticed that the rollers on the back of the timber jig were about 1/4 to a 1/2 inch off the log. So I think what I got to do to try to correct that is make sure that as I'm going down the log, I don't push too hard, and also that I make sure to make sure I've got that back of that saw in contact all the time, and that should help me to straighten out the boards. So here's where we just cut, and you can see how smooth that cut is. If you step back about 5 feet, you really would barely even notice the ripples in the wood. And it was, I didn't push very hard to get the saw to feed, but it was definitely taking smaller bites, and the saw wasn't bogging down. I was very happy to see I wasn't bogging the saw down. I made sure to cut a nice 90-degree angle here. I've got a good angle, good edge to work the timber jig on, so I can get a nice square cant. And then at the end of the log here, there's still a little bit of rot. We'll see what becomes of that, whether that makes a difference or not. But I really do need to be careful and make sure I keep the rollers on the back of the timber jig touching the log, because I think I'm putting the rail up too steep, and the weight of the saw is kind of lifting the back of the timber jig off, and that's causing me to have some uneven cuts. We'll keep working on that. The saw ran out of gas, so I went and topped off the tank and did a maintenance sharpening on the saw, which would be 2 to 4 strokes on each side. And I came back and I noticed the log has so much tension in it that since I started the cut, it's opened up about a 1/2 inch. I don't have any wedge in there. Crazy. Well guys, that'll just about do it for today. I turned the camera off after I cut the first board, just because moving that camera so much really it takes up a lot of time. But I ended up cutting 6 boards, and I'm getting much better. The boards are much closer to square now, so I think I'm learning some of the tips and tricks to make the mill work the best. And I got to remember when I'm using the mill to make sure when I'm making my cuts on the tee that I don't let these rollers get off the board, because I'm getting crooked cuts that way. And then when I end up cutting without the tee, I need to make sure that I keep this thing in full contact with the board. I notice that I actually end up, you put one hand down low here, your other hand here, and you just lift ever so slightly on the back handle here. And that seems to do the best job for keeping things square. And the boards are by far as square as I've got them today. I think they're like 5 1/8 by like 7/8 of an inch, but they're, if you measure them on both sides, it kind of had to double check, but they're actually the same measurement on both sides. And they came out, a lot smoother today. And the other thing I am noticing is, I did get a little bit of the brown on the bottom of the chainsaw. I tried not to force the saw through the wood. I did put a pretty decent amount of force on it. I noticed I was kind of putting my knee against my arm because it was just at the right position to kind of keep pressure on the saw. So I still don't think that the Stilo 36 is enough power, you know, to run this chainsaw mill all the time, but it's certainly doing the job. I mean, I've got 6 boards. I can't complain, but I definitely would want a Stihl 066. I mean, anything below a Stihl 066 to me seems like you're just trying to make do. So that might be the one difficulty in chainsaw milling. Folks, if you enjoyed the video today, I have a video called felling wedge practice. That's about using a chainsaw. I'll put a link to that one up here. And then there's another video I made called cutting firewood. Preparation equals success. That's actually a 2-part series. I'll put part 1 down here. You know, if you enjoyed today's video, it's probably going to end up being 15-20 minutes long by the time I'm done editing. But if you enjoyed, if you picked up a few tips along the way, these 2 videos over here will definitely help you out. So thanks for watching today, folks. I think this is going to be my last video. All I'm going to do next time is do my summary of what I think of the chainsaw mill, which will be a lot easier to film. I started filming today at about 9:30 in the morning, and it's now 4 o'clock, and I cut 6 boards. It did take me, I timed myself when I sharpened the saw. I took the chain and hand filed it to 10 degrees, and that did take me about a half hour. It was about 15 minutes per side, so that did take a while. I ended up filling up the chainsaw 2 times today. Each time I filled up the chainsaw, I did do a maintenance sharpening on it, and then when I started milling, like you guys remember, I did stop the saw twice to lower my rakers or my depth gauges. But you know, it's coming. Little by little, it's coming. I've got a much smoother chain. The boards are coming the right size, so I'm quite pleased with where we are. So again, guys, I think I started rambling once again. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the final chainsaw Logasol timber jig review, chainsaw milling final analysis or something like that. Have a great day, guys.